late High Renaissance in Italy is a real difficult period because as Italy became, developed into this very high kind of culture, it became the wonder of the rest of Europe, and the rest of Europe wanted to have a part of it. And they just started invading Italy. And so Italy was beset by invasions. The different ruling houses became more corrupt, and generally life in Italy became a lot more violent. But if you remember, we last were looking at Tintoretto, who was pushing painting in a different direction. The artists of the late Renaissance were feeling trapped by Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael, and they were seeking ways to go beyond them. And his way was Mannerism, which became a style that spread throughout Italy for a while. And just like, oops, what happened? What in the world happened? Oh, there it is. Okay, sorry. In Florence, the same thing was happening. And one of the leading exponents of the new Mannerism was someone called Rosso Fiorentino. And you can see the kind of exaggeration of forms, not only the exaggeration of forms, but the exaggeration of color. But this was a very unstable time in Florentine history. And he didn't stay there. He went to Rome. And after Rome, when Rome was sacked by the army of Charles V, he went to France. And he actually died in France. And I'll just show you one more of his paintings. He's a curious painter who I'm not that crazy about, but he gives you a real sense of what Mannerism was doing. This painting could almost be contemporary in some ways, because he's simplified the forms so much and exaggerated the colors. And he's also created a situation with these ladders here that doesn't really make sense. But now, going back a little bit, but talking about Florence and what was going on in Florence, you'll remember that I showed you this statue by Donatello, which was put in the Piazza Signoria during the Republic that rose after the Medici were driven out after the death of Lorenzo. It was a republic that was founded by Savonarola, but continued for a long time afterwards, after he was executed. But this became a symbol of the Republic. And it's interesting that there's a woman in charge who's about to chop off this guy's head. So the Republic was seen as a feminine force because everyone was involved. And in fact, it was an exceptional Republic. And anyone right next to this was a platform, steps that people could climb to the Ringhiera, where they could harangue the crowd. Any citizen could get up there and make a speech. Mm-hmm. So it was and this was the period when both Michelangelo and Leonardo were there, and Michelangelo did the David. The artists as a whole were very much in favor of the Republic. Some of them had been supported by the Medici, but they didn't like the fact that the Medici were becoming so powerful. Unfortunately, the Medici returned. They returned twice. They returned and then they were kicked out. And there was a very brief republic. Michelangelo actually went back to that short-lived republic, which was just 1527 to 1530. And he helped design the fortifications of Florence to defend Florence against his enemies. But the Medici came back with the support of a Spanish army, and they imposed their will upon the people of Florence. And as a sign of their power, their renewed power, they put up this statue by Benvenuto Cellini. And now we have a male in charge who's chopping the head off a woman who is in fact Medusa. It's Perseus slaying Medusa. It's interesting because Benvenuto Cellini was a goldsmith. And this is the only major sculpture that he ever did. He did it to prove that he could equal the great sculptors. He also wrote a book, an autobiography, which is quite worth reading. He was a braggart, a violent man, very vain, but it gives you a view of this period, which was an incredibly violent period. But you also get a sense of what it was like to be an artist in those days, if you can stand his personality. But anyway, this is the new Florence that emerges. Now, the man who was in control at this point was Cosimo the First. And here he is depicted by Giorgio Vasari, who became his principal painter, surrounded by artists and architects and scientists. But this was not the same Florence as before. He was an autocrat who ruled more and more ruthlessly. And his rule was facilitated actually by Vasari, who painted this picture, because Cosimo was picked by the rulers of Florence who wanted a member of the Medici back in power. And this guy was a poor distant relative who they thought they could control. But he was very cunning and he gained the upper hand. He went around all the time armed. He wore protective armor under his clothing. He spent his whole life being afraid he was going to be assassinated. But in the beginning, he's there, fearing assassination and trying to figure out how to become a ruler of the city. And Vasari, the painter, comes to him with a bundle. And he unwraps the bundle, and it's the arm of Michelangelo's David, the statue that at the time was in the Piazza Signoria, and which was the wonder of Florence, which had been broken during some of the upheaval. And Vasari had saved the arm and hidden it. So he came to Cosimo and he said, look, if you want to win the trust of the Florentines, let me restore the David, put this arm back. And also let me counsel you and circle you with artists. And that will give your administration the glory that it needs for the Florentines to appreciate it. So they together created a circle of artists and a republic, not a republic, I mean that was very, very powerful. Vasari, as a painter, now Vasari wrote the first book about the artists, his Lives of the Artists, in which he wrote about all the artists of Tuscany, back to Giotto, is worth reading, actually. It's a really good book, and it's probably the greatest thing he did, apart from some of his architecture. But as you can see, his painting, in my opinion, leaves a lot to be desired. He's incredibly talented. I mean, incredibly able to paint things, highly skilled. But for me, it's a rather unpleasant work of art. I don't know. What do you guys think? Any opinions?
I don't think the composition's very interesting. It's kind of just a crowd of people.
Overly crowded. Mm-hmm. The figures are obviously modeled on Michelangelo's way of doing figures, but there's no feeling in it.
Yeah. I don't have a response to it one way or the other.
No.
I mean, I wish I could paint crowded, but I don't really like it.
No. his work is all over the place because he was the court painter. And he painted the interior of the Dome of the Duomo. He painted the interior of Palazzo Vecchio. I mean, he didn't do it all himself. He had a team of artists who worked with him. But he did bring a lot of artists to Florence. And there was one who was actually, I think, quite an exceptional artist, though he represents this new period of male dominance and power. This is one of his most famous works, Giambologna, who actually wasn't Florentine. He came from Flanders. He studied in Rome. He came up to Florence where Cosimo adopted him as his principal sculptor. And actually, once he was there and he got commissions, Cosimo wouldn't let him leave the city. He lived the rest of his life there, sort of a prisoner of the city, although he was very well paid, et cetera, because they were afraid that some other country would take him away from them. But this Mercury is an exceptional work, and it's very, most people have seen this. It's almost as famous as the David in certain ways. But he also did sculptures like this, which actually, he's considered a Mannerist, but this starts to prefigure Baroque. Now, the interesting thing about this, these three figures are all carved out of one piece of marble, so it's a virtuoso performance here. But it's called the Rape of the Sabines, which is when the early Romans were looking for brides, so they raided the tribe of the Sabines and just took their women. But what's interesting is he sculpted this without having any idea what it was. And he just gave it the name of the Rape of the Sabines when it was put up in public in Florence. So that's another thing about this period with the Mannerists. They start to do work for their own pleasure that's not necessarily commissioned by anyone and doesn't necessarily have any subject. If you have any reactions to these, you're most welcome to say something. But this thing of violence and male dominance this is Hercules killing a Philistine, but it's also to indicate the dominance of Florence and its dominance over the city of Pisa. Quite terrifyingly violent painting, actually. I mean, sculptor.
The forearm with the knife looks really exaggerated in size.
It is. I mean, that's one of the, and that is one of the, in fact, characteristics of mannerism. But still, you can see he's an incredibly able sculptor, and he prefigures in many ways another sculptor we're going to look at the end of this, Bernini. But he did something else that I've always loved, and so I have to show some of them to you. He did for the gardens of the Boboli Palace, the palace of the Medici. He created these wonderful animals, and looks very modern. It's a peacock, but it's interesting. He's done the peacock with the tail, the feathers all closed. And it has a wonderful form to it. And this one I love. Sorry. It reminds me, these animals remind me a little of some of Picasso's animals. They have a wonderful, I like about them is that they're very playful, and they're not violent. And this one's interesting because 100 years before this, no one in Italy knew what this animal was or that it existed. It's a turkey.
It looks like it knows Thanksgiving is coming or something. It looks a little down in the mouth, doesn't it?
Right. But it's a wonderful depiction of a turkey, you know. These are all on display in the Bargello in Florence in a sort of open area. It's wonderful to just spend time with them. There are many others, but that's all I'm going to show you right now. So, okay, later than Giambologna, and from the north, an artist rose who is probably the most troubling and troubled artist in Italian history. Michelangelo Merci da Caravaggio. Caravaggio was where he was born. Caravaggio is very close to Milan. He studied painting and worked in the studio of an artist as a young man who had studied with Titian, and he pretty clearly knew the work of Giorgione as well as Titian, because it shows in his early work. He was a very troubled person. He eventually left northern Italy because he'd injured a policeman. In those days, if you got into trouble, if you just went to another part of Italy, you were probably safe because there was no general law there. There's just law in the different kingdoms. So he arrived in Rome, and probably because he was fleeing from justice, he arrived penniless. And it got mixed up with the bad crowd almost immediately. But he fortunately had connections to an important family there through his family, the Colonna family, which was related to families in Milan. And he showed immediately a great deal of ability. This is one of the earliest paintings we have of his. And I think he was 20 or so when he did this, or younger actually. But he matures very quickly, and he's initially collected by the wealthy in Rome, who are all connected with the church, of course, but are enormously wealthy. He's taken in actually by, let's see if I can find the name of it's Del Monte, that's right, Cardinale Del Monte. And so it's appropriate, this fruit there, isn't it? But this is, so his early subjects are mostly classical, and they're very, they cater to the expensive tastes and the indulgence of the ruling class there. Actually, Del Monte was famous for having a court around him with a lot of young boys, and who had intimate relations with him. And this is thought to be, there's some dispute as to who is the subject to this painting, but it's thought to be a very close companion of Caravaggio's at the time, who remained a friend of his throughout his life, but at the time they were probably lovers. Caravaggio was bisexual. We know of him having relationships both with men and with women. But it's an incredibly beautiful painting. And he continued, and he also did he created these genre paintings, which were immensely popular among wealthy. Like a young Rube has come to Rome, and the card sharks are playing him here. This guy's signaling to this guy what his hand is, and he's hiding cards behind his back here. He did a number of paintings on this theme. They're really good, though. They were quite new in Rome, because the Romans were still doing all their painting was pretty much religious. It also was all done from the imagination. Caravaggio did no drawings, and all his paintings were done from live models, direct. There were no studies. And this one is also very famous. It's a gypsy reading this guy's hand, and she's going to, at some point, rob him.
Mhm.
So
Something really clean about the palette there in that painting. I don't know, it's so simple, but
it's incredibly simple. It's Titian's rule of red, black, and white, really,
oh, here we go again. Yeah,
isn't it? I mean, look at it.
it's beautiful.
It's
Mhm.
beautiful. His use of light and dark, even in the very beginning of his work, is quite exceptional. But now the first religious theme, because until this point, you don't see any religious themes in his work. This is the repentant Magdalene,
Mhm.
which is it's got unlike the other ones, it's got an immense amount of emotion in it.
Mhm.
And also the beginning of this thing of surrounding figures with a huge amount of darkness.
Mhm.
Quite beautiful. And you kind of have to know the title to know what in the world is the subject here. But now his models were usually lower class. The women were often prostitutes. This one's interesting. It's not particularly, it shows how capable he was in the northern manner. This is quite reminiscent of Giorgione and Titian. But none of this really prepares you for what suddenly happens when he gets a major commission. This is a huge painting. The calling of Matthew. And Christ here, with his arm outstretched, following the line of the shadow, which if it continued would go right to Matthew's face, is inviting Matthew to join him and his disciples. And Matthew is saying, me? But to me, it's a stunning painting, and quite unprecedented in Italy at this time, because it's really the world in which he lived that he's painting, which artists didn't generally do. They did all these idealized paintings of religious subjects, and he's taken it and put it in the present with ordinary people. In fact, a lot of the ordinary people were considered undesirables by the class that was actually commissioning him. But in so doing, he brings, a little like Giotto, but in a very different way, he brings the religious stories back to the everyday and to our experience. But and most of these paintings, the painting commissions, you can see them in the churches in Rome. You just go into the churches, you put your money in a little machine that'll turn on the lights, and you can stare at them for as long as you want, as long as you have enough money. But there was also always a lot of violence in his work, because he was a violent person. He was known for spending 2 weeks painting without cease, doing the whole painting in 2 weeks, and then spending a month carousing, getting drunk, getting in fights. We know an awful lot about his fights because there are just hundreds of court records where he was told before a magistrate. And if he hadn't got very wealthy patrons, he would have ended up in a lot of trouble. But this is a really terrifying image. And it shows a real familiarity with violence. Quite different from Donatello's Judith and Holofernes that we saw at the beginning. He also got in trouble sometimes with his patrons, because he was quite unconventional in the way he painted things. This is the death of the Virgin. Now, normally, the death of the Virgin shows her being taken up into heaven. But here, she's clearly dead. Not only is she clearly dead, but her bare feet are showing, which was considered just utterly disrespectful of the Virgin. It's a very powerful painting, and he does something which is quite common with him. He invites us into the painting with the foreground figure, who's not exactly part of the story, but her emotion sets the whole tone of the painting and invites us into the painting. And she's really the most powerful figure in the painting. So this was refused by the church that commissioned it, but it was immediately snapped up by someone else. But again, if you want to talk about limited palette, here it is. It's red, black, white with some yellow.
Mm-hmm.
A very, very restricted palette. And everything is, look how the light comes down and just focuses right here. And her feet, which are naked, you barely even see them. I've got a close-up that we can look at here.
Why was that considered disrespectful to show her feet, bare feet?
Well, people didn't mind, the story being brought back to the common people, but they didn't like seeing holy figures with dirty or unwashed feet,
Gotcha.
or showing parts of their body that normally weren't acceptable. Women weren't, remember, in the Renaissance Italy, women's position was very much like women in the Arab world today. And they didn't show a lot of skin. It wasn't appropriate. The other story that floated around, which is one of the reasons it was rejected, was that the model was a prostitute for Mary. Because these are all live models that he used. He didn't invent anything. And he did the whole, these paintings, these are huge paintings, in a fury of a couple of weeks usually.
Oh my God.
I know.
So anyway, eventually he kills someone because he was constantly getting into fights and inviting people to fight him. His patrons couldn't help him, and he fled to Naples, where the Colonna family had links. So they couldn't help him in Rome because he was actually had a death sentence on him from the Pope. So he did this painting in Naples, which is one of my least favorite of his paintings, but is clearly one of his most Baroque paintings in the literal sense of the word. It's the 7 works of mercy, which I have. Bury the dead. You see this guy's feet here. He's being buried by these people. Visit the imprisoned and feed them. Well, both is happening here. This woman's visiting someone in prison, and she's also sharing her milk with him. Clothe the naked. Shelter the homeless. This man who is seeking a room in an inn, and then refresh the thirsty, which curiously is Hercules drinking water from a bone that was given by God in a myth, in a religious story. Anyway, to me, it's just too busy. And also, I have a real problem when he depicts the angels this literally. But it's a tour de force in terms of composition. Anyway, he painted a number of paintings in Naples, and then he headed, of all places, to Malta, which at the time was controlled by the Knights of Malta. Now, the Knights of Malta were an armed religious group And they were initially very impressed by him, and they actually took him into the order. He became a Knight of Malta, and he did he painted many of the knights. He also painted this huge painting for them. This may be one of his largest paintings. I don't remember the size, but it's like 15 feet high or more. And it's the beheading of John the Baptist, who, if you remember the story, Salome requested his head when he refused to be seduced by her. And a very dark and a grim painting. Well, he eventually got into a fight with another knight. He was imprisoned, and somehow he escaped. He had to have had help from someone there to escape the Knights of Malta, because no one escaped. And he went to Sicily. And he painted across Sicily. The one that I've seen there that I absolutely love is in Syracuse, where Santa Lucia was born, and she was also martyred in Roman times. And this he painted for the Church of Santa Lucia, the burial of Santa Lucia. But look how radical it is. There's Santa Lucia, and the foreground is occupied by the grave diggers. And then there's this vast kind of dark space above them. You can see that he's becoming more and more obsessed with death. And darkness is becoming more and more predominant in his painting. But his paintings don't lose their force. At this point, he was considered very unstable. He thought he was being pursued, and maybe he was, by the knight who he had a fight with. And he would actually go to sleep fully clothed with all his weapons on him. And he would act apparently very bizarre a lot of the time. But he could still do these incredible paintings. So he returns to Naples, and he gets in a fight there. And apparently, I mean, it may have been people who were pursuing him, we don't know, but his face is disfigured. He gets word that Rome is going to pardon him, and he heads back towards Rome, and he paints this picture as a gift to the bishop who he thinks is going to help him gain his pardon, as a sort of repentance, because this is David holding the head of Goliath, except the head of Goliath is actually a self-portrait. Mm-hmm. So that's Caravaggio, the way he saw himself at that time. And it's a beautiful painting. I mean, it's just as good as any of his other work, even though at this point he was in very bad shape. So he takes a boat back towards Rome with his paintings. At some point misses the boat when it stops somewhere, and is running along the shoreline trying to catch up with it at its next stop, and dies of a fever. Mm-hmm. And we don't know what he exactly died of. May have been malaria. His body was found, his remains were found in 2010. They're pretty sure because they did DNA tests. And what they found was a very high level of blood, of lead in his blood, in his bones. And that may have had something to do with his fits of anger and madness, but we don't really know. So he died quite young, but his impact on art was just huge. You can't imagine someone like Rembrandt without Caravaggio as a precursor. So he's the first real artist of the Baroque. Now there's one other artist who comes later, who's a young man when Caravaggio dies. A man who could have been a great painter, and maybe in Caravaggio's manner. I mean, you can see from his self-portrait that he he's a really good artist. Now, Gian Lorenzo Bernini was one of these people like Raphael, who was a child prodigy, like Mozart, for instance. At age 8, he was already sculpting, doing sculptures that adults would have admired. His father was a sculptor who'd been trained in Florence, but was in Naples. And the young Gian Lorenzo Bernini worked with him from his earliest childhood. When he was 8, his father took the family to Rome because he had some big commissions with the Vatican. And the Roman elite were amazed by this child of 8, 9, and 10 who was doing these incredible sculptures, assisting his father, but also doing his own work. So he had patronage right from the very beginning. And he was adopted very, very early on by Cardinal Scipione Borghese, and who admired him immensely. And then another friend of his became Pope. Maffeo Barberini became Pope. And from that moment on, he became the most influential and successful artist in Rome. He was in Rome. He basically controlled Rome for 50 years under 8 popes. He began as a sculptor, but he very quickly became an architect, city planner. There was nothing he wasn't in charge of. Artists of the time said a little ruefully, nothing happens in Rome without the assent of Bernini. He didn't live the checkered life of Caravaggio, but he also had incidents where he was very violent. It was just part of this period. For the Borghese, he did a number of sculptures. This was the first one that absolutely, won him the praise of the entire city of Rome. It's Apollo pursuing Daphne, and he depicts the moment at which Daphne turns into a tree, starts to turn into a tree. Now this is done in marble. Look at those leaves. Look at the detail. I mean, the level of facility with a really obdurate medium is just incredible. I mean, some of these leaves are just attached by little branches. You know, how could he do that? No one could believe that anyone had worked marble like this. But it's so part of his genius is his just facility, but he also can capture moments of movement, key moments. And he's captured the moment when she's turning into a tree, and he's surprised in pursuit. He's suddenly surprised to see that he's not going to be able to capture her because she's transforming in front of his eyes. But this is Baroque. This defines Baroque. The incredibly complex movement, the high point of action, and the amazing facility of the work. He also did this one of himself as David. And you see, he picks the very moment that David is about to sling his stone. But you see the determination in David's face. This is a self-portrait. And guess who held the mirror while he sculpted his own face? Cardinal Scipione Borghese. He admired him so much that he held the mirror for him. Which shows you the incredible power and influence that artists had at this point in Italy. Well, one could go on forever. He did so much sculpture, but he also completely reconfigured, he completely reconfigured the face of Rome because he was in charge of all the different projects in Rome. I will show you some of those in a minute, but first I'm going to show you what is probably the height of Baroque. for a while he was out of fashion with one of the popes, and he took on a commission to do the mystical vision of Santa Teresa, when she dreamt that an angel was plunging a golden arrow repeatedly into her heart and her chest. And the pain was so great, but her ecstasy was even greater, and she saw God. Okay? And that's the moment he's capturing here. But he's also designed everything around the sculpture. So he created an entire set for his sculpture, which is also naturally lit from above. So this is Baroque at its most extreme. For me, it's a bit much. It's way too rich for me. But it's quite impressive, and the church loved it because this kind of thing just wowed people and helped them to control and maintain Catholicism at a time when it was being threatened by the Reformation. So this style spread because of Bernini's fame and longevity, spread throughout the whole of Europe. Everyone flocked to see his work and copied him throughout Europe. Also Sicily, the Spanish sculptors, the Spanish architects copied him in Sicily. But he also changed the face. Oh, well, here's a detail first of the actual sculpture, which, you know, a lot of people absolutely love this one. To me, I have trouble with it. It's even just the sculpture is a little bit much for me. And the angel is almost too sentimental, but that's my own opinion. You may think differently, I don't know. And these are all rays of God from above. Anyway, he also, almost every piazza in Rome was decorated by him. This is one of his more famous, the Fountain of the Four Rivers in Piazza Navona, which probably most of you know. Now, at this point, he would have designed it. He would have done the maquette, but all the different sculptors who are now working for him would have actually executed this. And finally, because he was the architect of the city, he also was the architect of St. Peter's. He's the one who's responsible for St. Peter's Square, which of course isn't square at all, for this incredible colonnade, which is a brilliant addition to the building. He also decorated the entire, pretty much the whole interior of St. Peter's. But so he by himself established Baroque. He's the most extreme example of it, and it spread throughout Europe because of him. So next week we're going to leave Italy, and we're going to go to Spain and the Netherlands, because, well, the movements of Italy had been spreading throughout Europe. But the two people we're going to look at, El Greco and I'm just spacing his name.
Van Gogh, no?
No.
Goya?
No.
Them?
Why am I spacing his name? I'm sorry.
Vermeer?
No. Bruegel the Elder. Both Bruegel the Elder and El Greco had contact with Italian art, but were both highly independent and created forms which, though in the case of El Greco, it flows out of mannerism, is highly eccentric and personal. And Bruegel the Elder does something very interesting. He pretty much turns his back on Italian art, even though he was in Italy for several years, and creates something very different, and one of the more original artists in the world, in my opinion. So that's the end of. Now, I hope these little history books are of some value to all of you. I hope you appreciate them. They're a lot of work, so I just want to know that people enjoy them and want them to continue. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Okay, that's all. I just wanted to find that out.
For all the work you put into it, Anthony.
Yeah.
Well, I know a lot of the stuff, but I have to go back and check all the images. And I also have to find the images, which takes quite a while to find images that are appropriate. But it's worth it. I mean, it's a value to me. It's a real brush up on art history. And I discover new things, which is very exciting.
It's very interesting.
Well, good. And Ari, I hope to see some painting from you next week. I don't want to pressure you, of course, but
I'm just bad at organizing, but I really want to. I really miss it, and I'll really try. Yeah,
great. And so I really look forward to seeing everyone next week, and happy painting.
Thank
Okay.
you so much.
See ya, everybody. See ya next
Bye, guys.
week. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye.